In this chapter, we're going to talk about the asymmetric Benoni, and that's generally what everybody knows by Benoni. But in this book, he sort of differentiates that with that if when black takes on d5, is white taking with the c pawn and the e pawn. And this chapter focuses if white takes with the c pawn. Benoni generally have not that great of a sort of reputation, and probably quite rightly so. In a way, it's extremely attractive from black's perspective. It's very easy to tell you that, sure, black plays the move g6, he's going to have a strong bishop on g7, and then he's going to have amazing counterplay with f5 or b5, just undermining the white center. And it's also quite easy to say that, well, bishop on g7 and on c8, the knight on f6, and this knight on b8 can either go to a6 or to d7. And we're going to put a rook on the e file. It almost sounds like, doesn't the black position play itself? But unfortunately, it is not that easy. If you sort of change it to the white perspective, well, it's clear we have a pretty broad center. And some point we will perhaps even push it further and can push f4 and e5 or f5. There's going to be a considerable amount of attack like this. But also, we can also play in a much more positional style. We spoke a lot about the b5 break, but we can just prevent it by a4 and suppressing it like this. And also when we talk about the f5 break, well, generally, I never really dared being on the white side of the Benoni, but at some point I realized that, well, this system of playing knight e2 to g3 was actually quite good, because this knight on g3, while not being immediately aggressive, it covers hugely important squares, f5 and h5, meaning that black counterplay becomes much less attractive. So at some point there was really this sort of feeling that the Benoni was quite a dubious opening. I remember at some point talking with Nick DeFermian, who was he's one of the leading experts of the Benoni and played it a lot. It's a typical thing you will do, let's say, in open tournaments. You need to win with black, and you create this asymmetry, and then you use your playing skills and experience to beat a perhaps lower rated opponent. And he told me that, yeah, most Benoni positions looks bad, but only half of them are as bad as they look. And that is perhaps an interesting perspective. And I kind of will even believe that before starting looking at this chapter. But this chapter's example is kind of devastating from black's perspective, but not that bad, but still not that pleasant. I think quite recently I even saw Magnus Carlsen would play the Benoni, and I obviously helped him prepare that. But it is a very double-edged structure, and it's the kind of things that are generally good for white, but the black players tend to be specialists, and white players doesn't face them that often. So black will often do quite okay. But anyway, a lot of talk. Let's delve into the example and sort of start looking at the specifics of it. Our first game in the Benoni chapter is Akopian against Pansulaya. He starts it off with a middle game position, but actually I thought it's necessary to explain some trends of opening development the last 10 years since the book was out, because else I think the position he starts with becomes very hard to grasp, because one of the black pieces seems quite misplaced. So it's basically like an explanation of these kind of internet jokes you see, where how did this thing end up there? Well, how did the black bishop end up on e7? Let me try to spend the next 10 minutes explaining that. So here we have a pretty standard Benoni position. Black has just played the move g6. Perhaps the knight on f3, you can argue, it's not necessarily the optimal square for the knight. But very often black gets to play the Benoni by threatening to play the Nimzo-Indian, which means that white would often play the move knight f3, and then black is playing the Benoni only. So the knight very often ends up on the f3 square. When this book was published, the move bishop f4 was considered incredibly strong, almost like a refutation of the Benoni at the time. the idea is that, well, in the game black plays a6. The idea is if you play the move bishop to g7, then quite puzzling, white can simply start attacking black's uncastled king. It sounds almost surreal, right? Just in a normal opening, you can actually make this huge ambush. But white was successful with that. He played the move queen to a4 check. The point is that, well, if you go knight to d7, well, you can't really do that. You cannot develop naturally, because then you're going to lose the pawn on d6. White can just take it. So after queen a4 check, well, sure, black plays bishop d7. This threatened the queen on a4. It looks weird from white's perspective. But the point is that after the move queen b3, we created a weakness on the b7 square and also on the d6 square. Black could defend it with queen to c7, but it's a rather passive move. And white has ideas like, let's say, knight d2 to c4, attacking d6, and even some points knight b5 when there's no check on a5. So queen c7 is kind of considered a passive move, and white is just better. So after the move queen b3, well, many had tried it, but I think it was Caruana who popularized it by playing the move b5. Caruana had this phase where he suddenly started playing the Benoni with black. And he played the move b5. And the idea is that, well, if you go bishop takes d6, it almost feels too good to be true. We just won a central pawn, and now we're even preventing black from castling. But after queen b6, things are not so simple. We attack the bishop, and it can't stay in this diagonal, right? Because, well, there's no squares. So it has to go to e5, and after castling e3, c4, black has quite some development for the sacrificed pawn, and this king is somewhat vulnerable on the e1 square. Quite recently, Magnus Carlsen had this position with black and even won against Vincent Keimer in a tournament in Germany. And, well, I'm part of Magnus's opening team. Well, after all, right now I might actually be the only one on his team. And, of course, we had prepared this, and modern computer says black is just fine here. And modern computer says the same, that if after b5, knight takes b5, black can just take on b5, queen b5, knight d7. And after bishop takes d6, knight e4 is well, not good for black, but absolutely okay for black. This would also be a position that, let's say, in pre-computer times, we would be very puzzled here. It's two extra pawns for white, actually. And he can even play the move bishop e5 because, well, you can't take this one because of the pin. But the computer says, no, you can just castle, and after bishop g7, king takes g7. You have a strong knight on e4. There is counterplay in the b line against the b2 pawn, and the king on e1 is kind of weak. Black is absolutely fine. So the current theoretical status is that after bishop f4, you can play bishop g7, queen a4, bishop d7, and b5 here, doing absolutely fine. But this was not the case in 2013 when this game was from. So black played the move a6. It's kind of a clever move because a6 intends to play b5. And the very, very logical move of preventing that would be the move a4. But then you can play bishop g7, and now there is no check on a4 because, well, you can't take your own pawns, right? So that is quite logical. So after a6, white started looking for other ideas. And in this game, they played a move knight to d2. A reasonable question would be to ask, why can't black just play b5 here? And actually, our author says that this is kind of a reasonable move. But the problem, of course, is, from a strategical point of view, is that white is immediately going to challenge these beautiful pawns. I mean, the way they stand now is fine, but due to this tension, well, the pawn actually has to move forward. And after b4, knight to ce4, well, white has a nice square here, and with this bishop, he looks towards the d6 pawn, which means this bishop is a bit stuck here. And potentially, the knight can also jump to this very beautiful square c4, which is, well, basically eternally white's because of this pawn structure, with the pawn having gone to b4. Computer says that in this position, it's not too bad for black, but he really have to play the move knight h5. And now, well, you're starting to play f5 next, and it's become a extremely messy concrete position that has no sort of general value for the Benoni. It's just a very interesting opening position, but that's pretty far from our theme. So after knight d2, Pansolaya, who's quite an expert on the Benoni, chose to play the move knight to d7. White followed up by queen to c2. And, well, we see here it's a little bit difficult for black to make a move again, right? This bishop is somewhat stuck here. It really would like to go to g7, but then this pawn is hanging on d6. The author says that now you should play b5, and after a4, b4, knight c2, e4, knight b6 is a nice move. It attacks the pawn on d5, and it also sort of starts insinuating counterplay with the bishop f5 towards the queen here, and black seems to have a decent position. Black chose to play bishop e7, and that's basically considered a very awkward square for the bishop in the Benoni. It's really so much better on g7. On e7, it's, well, it's stuck. It's the only thing it does, it's, prevent white from taking on d6. But black's, black needs counterplay in the Benoni. He's structurally worse. It's white who has a broad, nice central advantage, and somehow you need counterplay. And the bishop on e7 is really not helping with that. So that's kind of dubious. Now Akopian decided to play a4, stopping the b5 advance. Again, black should understand that playing normal moves, he ends up in a tricky spot. Computer says you really have to fight with knight h5 to try and destabilize white's position before white manages to set up his pieces in the game. Bishop h6 obviously looks annoying. It prevents the king from castling. But black can play something like knight e5. It threatens to jump to g4, harassing the bishop. And if h3, then you can play the move f5. And this knight is going to go to f7, eject the bishop, and then you can castle. And it's a pretty odd position, but not that bad for black, I would say. Bad for black is, however, what happens now. So Pansolaya castles, and white gets to play e4. This means that, well, for a start, it takes space, it sort of solidifies the d5 pawn, but it also means that should you go knight h5, well, we can go to h6, but we can retreat to e3 later. So somehow the sting of knight h5 has kind of been removed. Pansolaya goes rook to e8, white goes bishop to e2, and the bishop goes back to f8. And this is more or less where our author starts. And, well, the point was, I thought it's more or less essential to understand that, well, f8 is a very weird square to have the bishop on. And I thought it was interesting to explain it like this. Also, maybe you know by now, but my sort of core interest in chess is really this kind of opening nuances. So I thought I would talk a little bit about that. But now back to general structures, which is the theme of this course. So white castles here, and we generally have a nice typical Benoni position, but I would say things has went pretty well for white. His position is quite harmonious. I mean, well, the knight is on d2 and the bishop on f4. And this is kind of ideal. I mean, very often we would see white play knight to d2, and the bishop was still on c1. This is a very popular line. I mean, well, it's just the main line of the Benoni. But here white gets kind of the best of both worlds. And there's also the bishop on e2, which means knight h5 is not really a possibility. I know that Fischer one has played knight h5 in a world championship match and beaten Spassky, but that was more the exception to the rule rather than the rule. And he was also not that great. He won because he was a great player, not because of this actual concept. So here it's pretty tough for black, I would say. I would say these pieces are well placed, and the knight is also about to jump to c4. So we said some nice things about white's position, but a huge part of the problem is also that there's not much nice to say about the black position. You can say that hasn't he just developed his pieces to quite natural squares, but not so much. I mean, a typical plan would be to prepare the b5 break, but for that, in this position, white is pretty well set up, and you would normally have a knight on c7 who could sort of help this advance. But here, it's not really the case. So it's a mixture of white having pieces in good positions, but also black really lacking counterplay. Pansulaya tries to put the knight on e5. That's quite reasonable. You want to go bishop to d7 and go rook b8 next. The problem is that, as I said, white has a favorable version, and he actually has several good choices. He does something in the game that works out splendidly, but the author says that perhaps it would be even stronger to play the move h3. I guess it looks kind of passive to you. Why would you, I mean, I'm talking so nicely about the white position. Why would you play h3? But it's a dual purpose move. For a start, controlling the g4 square is very relevant. The g4 square is kind of part of the black counterplay. Sometimes you will see one of the knights, it could even be both, depending on circumstances, launching sort of out to this square. As well, white would, potentially like to push forward with f4. And then especially, well, the knight could be annoying if it has the g4 square. I would also say that while I said that knight h5 could always be met with bishop e3, there can be circumstances where we would like to retreat our bishop to h2. On h2 is actually very well placed. The author gives a line bishop g7 and he just goes bishop to h2. And it's a mixture of that, well, the bishop's influence is in this diagonal, but on h2 is actually completely safe while still influencing in this diagonal. Well, the beautiful thing with bishops is that they control a full diagonal, and it doesn't matter if it's on f4 and h2. It exercises the same kind of influence. But on h2, it's much more cozy, right? It's connected with the king, and very importantly, it also insinuates that at some point we will break with f4. So this is a major sort of improvement of the white position. I think the author mentions, let's say, queen e7, then white will start expanding like this, and next is the rook is going to come to e1, and we're going to break with e5, and the queen is quite misplaced on e7. He also mentioned that if you go queen c7, we could play f4, but we could even consider flicking in the move a5 just to take the sting out of the b5 counterplay. And something like, let's say, rook b8, he says f4, knight back. Knight to c4 is a humongous advantage for white. And I think this is a nice position to look at, that this bishop on h2 is actually very well placed. Don't get it wrong that this bishop is out of play. No, it's on a very relevant diagonal. You can see that there is this potential targets there, but mainly it's gonna help with pushing e5, and that's gonna open up things when the bishop actually gonna be a huge entity on the h2 square. So I think, well, this is a cool example of something that perhaps looks pretty weird, but actually is a very major asset. So h3 could be a nice move, and I spoke a lot about the bishop being an asset, but Akopian happily gives it up on e5. Now in the game, Pansulaya takes back with the rook and, well, gets outplayed. So it's reasonable to ask the question, why can't we just take back with the pawn on e5, solidify the center, and have a pair of bishops? Well, that was just a fairy tale I told you. In reality, white is strategically much better here. White has a stable central advantage, but the real problem is that now we play the move a5. And basically this leaves, I would say, these pawns, but to some extent also the e5 pawns, as very vulnerable and awkward. And especially this knight is going to jump to c4. It's going to be a powerhouse there. It's going to look at the b6 square, which is weak, but it's also going to look in the direction of the e5 pawn and even to some extent to the d6 square. It's important to understand that this position is strategically very much superior for white. So don't make this mistake of thinking, yeah, a pair of bishops, control of the center, everything is good. No, there is major weaknesses in the black position, and probably to an irreparable extent. So Pansulaya took back with the rook on e5. Akopian then gains time, pushing it back. The rook goes to e8, and white plays the move f4. This is also, I would say, somewhat typical, and it's the kind of position that could be either very powerful for white or perhaps not too bad for black. This one looks like a good version for white. White has somehow won time. This bishop on f8 still somehow strikes me as not very efficient in sort of generating counterplay. It's serving purely defensive purposes right now, and that's not how you play the Benoni. Benoni is basically, well, you have to accept that your position is strategically exposed, and what you get in return is counterplay. So, well, if you're a Benoni player, it doesn't help having passive instincts like this. He chooses to cover the e5 square like this, which is also somewhat normal. And after the move rook a e1, he goes rook b8. So he's actually starting to prepare counterplay with b5. The author mentions that you should really play the move knight to b6, trying to exchange knights. And well, the exchange will be quite favorable for black. It's actually quite a typical motive to do like this. And normally it forces white to either retreat to d2, which is the most reasonable here, or in some other lines you would even retreat to the a3 square, but probably less so in this position. I mean, white is still going to be better after something like this, but black can play the knight back, covering this square, sort of making this advance slightly less likely. And then it's up to white to find a way to sort of not just repeat move, but improve his position. Pansolaya played the move rook a b8 instead. And this gives white the option of playing a5. It can look like, well, why on earth would black be doing this? This actually happens quite often in the Benoni, but probably black should have played the move b5 immediately. He was trying to play it later, but get very harshly punished for that. b5, obviously, well, white has to take en passant, else black just has an awesome position, takes. And the idea is that now we start trying to exchange knights, and we get some activity in the b file. This is not too bad for black. Of course, we have gotten an isolated pawn here, but the Benoni is this kind of opening that you have a, from a structural point of view, a dubious position already. So you don't mind too much creating further positional weaknesses as long as you get activity, and that you actually do here. The typical thing for white is that, depending on circumstances, but they're quite favorable here, you can jump to the a5 square and really getting to c6 here will win an exchange. But this is not too bad after something like queen c7. And well, this is perhaps a more typical Benoni position. Sure, white is probably better here, but it's complicated. And black has some hope that the bishop will turn to g7. And it's not that easy for white to play. I think Pansolaya wanted to do this. He wanted to go, he played queen c7. He wanted to play b5 next, but not having this threat of knight to c6 forking queen and rook like this. But he had underestimated the next move. White then plays the move e5 here. This is, well, an extremely typical break in the Benoni. The relevant question is if it's tactically possible or not. Black could, of course, the critical thing is what happens if it's taken. Well, the author says you can play the move d6, and I think taking with the bishop runs into knight d5. When the queen is in trouble, it has to keep the bishop protected after something like queen to c6. Most likely bishop f3 is going to be a lethal threat with sort of discovered checks happening, and the black position seems to be collapsing. So after d6, the author mentions we should go back to d8, but after f5, white has tremendous compensation for the sacrificed pawn. He has a strong pawn on d6. This bishop is weak, but also, well, the f pawn is starting to harass black's position, and also he will be able to put the knight on e4 when he's going to have this extremely powerful knights. And, well, there is a lot of examples where black basically just gets busted like this, and I think we will see one more in this course. So this very, very typical. He chooses to just ignore the white center, which is quite interesting. He plays the move b5 and knight takes to sort of exchange pieces. Actually, there is quite some examples where, sure, white gets this center, but he lacks a way to sort of follow it up, and then if it only leads to exchanges, let's say on d6, or you have to make a pawn sacrifice with e6, who knows how good it is for white. The problem for Pansolara is that, unfortunately, there is this very powerful move, knight to e4. It eyes the square on f6, because there is no bishop. Well, the bishop is misplaced, and the bishop can't really go to g7 because, well, then things are going to collapse on the d6 square. So after knight e4, it's more or less game over. Pansolara tries some kind of desperate counterplay. He plays the move bishop to f5, but Akopian gives a check, and he doesn't even want to pick up on e8 immediately with check. He plays the move queen to c3, and after takes on e5, Pansolara actually decided, okay, this is enough. He resigned. The author mentions that, well, rook e d8 is a move. It's not a move because then you can play rook f5, and after gf5 there is queen g3, and well, king h8 is queen g8 mate, and I think he just wants to show this line, king h8, knight g8 is checkmate. So yeah, I think let's leave the diagram sort of final remarks here. It's a beautiful mate, but well, I managed to explain some kind of weird development in sort of the modern theory of the Benoni, but also I think we got to discuss some kind of Benoni position. So, well, that's a start on this chapter. Our next game is between Gabriel and Kekelidze, and it's an interesting position we have here. What I would say jumps to mind is, well, the knight is on g3. I said in the previous example that typically the knight is on f3, but it's not always the case. And this makes quite a difference, right? I mean, white is ready to play the move f4 without having to remove the knight first. And as well, the knight on g3 is both quite useful in protecting the pawn on e4 and even sort of preventing the f5 break. So a knight on g3 can be quite powerful in the Benoni, I would say. White's last move was the queen to e2, and he's really taking control of the b5 square, basically making this pawn push impossible. But it's black to move here, and black plays a quite a good move. As I said sort of in the previous game, black really needs to create counterplay in the Benoni, and that's going to be some weaknesses in that process. I also mentioned that this knight on g3 can be quite strong, but it's also a bit vulnerable. And here, black plays the nice move h5. It's not like you can argue, well, does it threaten h4? To some extent it does, but not necessarily. Even there is plenty of games where this knight retreats to h1. And while it might look misplaced there, which it obviously is, white can later play the move f4 and the knight comes to f2 with actually quite a decent position. So it's a matter of how should white react here. In the game, he pushes with f4. He is spectacularly successful, but the author says, right here the time is actually not great. Does it mean that the white plan has failed when f4 is not a really good move? Not at all. The computer says that rook fe1, or it even suggests going to c1 actually, is a very nice position for white. The author debates this position after rook e1, and he says it's not so obvious what black should be doing. The problem is that, let's say, if you play something like h4, we're just going to retreat to f1. And you constantly have to watch out for bishop g5 attacking this pawn. Sometimes the pawns on h4 can be quite an asset in the attack, but here it feels pretty lonely, and it's hard to somehow combine it with something very reasonable, I would say. So after rook fe1, he suggests the move knight to e5. As we saw in the previous game, sometimes you do give up your pair of bishops, but here I think white would like to sort of keep it. And the problem is that, well, should you play the move bishop to d7, which of course prepares the trussed b5. The problem is that after the move f4, this knight is lost on the e5 square. So somehow, after rook fe1, it's not that trivial for black, actually. But I think Gabriel didn't want to go into this kind of passivity, so he pushes with the move f4. And at first sight, it looks awesome, right? I mean, you have this broad center with a lot of potential. And you would argue that, as we see in the game, h5 has weakened this structure. Black reacts well at first. He plays the move c4. This is extremely typical in the Benoni, that you sacrifice a pawn like this. Sometimes it's actually a pure sacrifice just to open up lines and speed up the development. Here, it's not even a sacrifice. The point is, if you take it, black can play the move h4, and basically you have undermined the pawn on e4. If this knight jumps to h1, well, we can just take here, right? So somehow, after c4, we have to retreat. Now, unfortunately for Kekelidze, he mistimes his counterplay. He has a nice position here. He should have pushed in the move h4. The knight has to retreat to h1. And as I said, potentially this can end up very well for white. But black is in time with good counterplay. He plays the move b5, and after, let's say, takes, even rook a7 as in the game, queen d8. Somehow, black is starting to undermine with b4 and create counterplay, and there's no obvious way forward for white. Compared to what we see in the game, it makes sense mentioning that here, if white tries this typical sacrifice we will see later in the game, after takes f5, there is this nice move knight f8, and somehow with the knight stuck on h1 here and the knight protecting in this direction, black is quite fine here. He's even better, says the computer. But after bishop c2, Kekelidze plays the move b5. Now there's going to be this swap in the sort of a file, and the move rook a7. This is also quite typical, and the idea is that, well, of course, the rook is going to have nice influence on the 7 rank, and if there's rook b7, you can interpolate this sort of small trick. Knight takes b5, it attacks the queen, and obviously you can't take here because the queen will be hanging from the rook on a7. So this is a typical trick that actually happens also in other openings, the Benoni, but is quite typical here. Black goes back to d8, and there is, I mean, a huge amount of tension in this position. And, well, you can see that, I would say, the white position obviously looks nice, but the center is not stable. Black is threatening to undermine it with h4 and b4. So it's a temporary thing that white has the center. You cannot sort of just protect it long term and do a complete squeeze. You actually have to do something with it. And the very, very typical way of doing something with it is this sacrifice. First, you sacrifice with e5. Obviously, you're threatened to take on f6, so black has to react. He takes the pawn, and then you really don't take back here, because then, well, after something like this, well, you can see the knight has gotten a good square, this bishop come to life, and so on and so forth. No, you play the move f5, and yes, it's a pure pawn sacrifice, but it's a very dominant one. Basically, I would say all these black pieces are very passive. And, well, especially due to the pawn being on h5, there is a target on g6 we are threatening to take there. Black now chooses to play knight f8, which is a bad move in this position. The very standard way of fighting back is that black is in no way gonna hold on to material. He's, on the contrary, desperate to sacrifice a pawn back with e4. The idea is that, well, when white start taking it, he's opening up files for the black pieces. The problem is that in this exact position after b4, it turns out that you can take on g6 and, well, something like this, taking back, then the move bishop takes g6 is just winning for white. The author gives the line bc3, and now you give a check, and after king h8, there is rook takes f6, queen takes f6, queen takes h5, and the king is toast here. But that was for concrete reasons. In general, when this strong pawn sacrifice happens, it's quite essential for black to fight back like this. This he doesn't have available in this position, which means that it's quite tragic for him. He does the move knight to f8, and white swaps like this. We saw in the previous line, and I said this is quite good for black, but there the move h4, and the knight h1 was sort of included, and this knight would be somewhat stupid there. Right now, well, the whole point of this sacrifice in the center is that white can get this incredibly beautiful sort of square on e4 for a knight, and well, he has two knights who can jump there, which means even black having one defender doesn't matter. White plays the move queen to f2. It basically sort of, well, I'll use a golf term, it tees up for putting something on e4. It makes sure that when it gets there, it even has a cleaner hit at the black position. There's basically no reasonable way to defend here. He tries to move rook to b7, but, well, you just exchange, you go bishop g5. It threatens to win a piece on f6, and after knight to h7, well, you could just retreat with bishop h4, and then you have a threat of taking on g6, and there's also a threat of knight e4 with a pin. This is winning in a trivial way, but Gabriel, for our amusement, chose to play the move knight takes h5. Maybe now black could fight a little bit with rook f8, but I don't think it matters so much for our perspective. He took on h5, then bishop takes h7. You have to take back with the king. You can't take with a knife due to the pin, right? And after king to h7, the nice move knight to e4. This basically wants to win the piece back on f6, but under more favorable circumstances. And of course, the slight detail is that if knight e4, threatening the queen, we can give a check, and then we collect the queen next, so that doesn't work. So after knight e4, the game was, I think, bishop to c8, bishop takes f6, queen takes d5. And while materially it's not a disaster for black, he's a pawn up. After the move queen h4, there's a basically unstoppable threat of taking this one and getting to the king, but also just bishop takes g7 and queen entering the f6 square is a disaster. So game finished quite quickly, something like this. And now, well, the quiet killing move, knight to g3, goes to h5. And it also pins in this direction, so it's game over like this, because bishop b7, while it threatens mate on g2, knight h5 defends the mate backwardsly, but just wins something on g7. Okay, the final moves were not too important, I would say, but I thought in general it's an interesting position. It's a little bit atypical, as I mentioned, with the knight not being on f3, but we see here white putting quite some interest in stopping this break. And then we see black actually unleashing a wave of counterplay. He goes h5, he goes c4, he goes b5 in a very, very typical Benoni way. And we see that, you know, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And we try to debate the sort of the pros and cons. I also thought that just this move rook fe1, quietly sort of making room for the knight to retreat, is quite useful. But of course, one should also understand that when white goes f4, it's either brilliant or in this case not so brilliant, because there is tactical counterplay. But I think I went into these kind of things in some detail, so I hope it was interesting. Our next game is quite a puzzling starting position, because it looks like a normal Benoni, but there is this knight hanging on c6. So obviously, black has just taken on d5, and white has taken back with the c pawn, getting us this Benoni position. But the nice thing is that now we have a pretty good excuse for debating which square would we actually like to put a knight on, ideally, in this kind of Benonis. Here in the game, black actually plays the move knight to d4. And this looks like a very obvious move, because you get this very beautiful knight on d4, and the white pawns are never going to contest it. So it looks like a very beautiful knight. But to some extent, white can play around it. Actually, both the book and also modern computer says that knight e5 is a considerably better move. The idea is that, well, there is this idea of taking on d3 and then winning the b2 pawn next with the bishop. And it's not so simple for white to deal with this. For instance, if you play the move bishop to e2, black can attack with f5. If you castle, well, then f takes e4 happens, and we end up with this isolated pawn and a beautiful knight behind it, which is sort of not only sort of beautiful like on d4, but even on e5, it has the same qualities, but it looks, I would say, in more aggressive directions. And the point is that if you take on f5, this is a very nice move, knight to c4. Well, it threatens the queen and the bishop, so white obviously has to take it. But then you can give a check, and either if they play g3, or even in the book mentions king d1, queen takes c4, a position like this, black just has awesome compensation. Well, if the pawn was on g3, because of the queen being in this diagonal, white could not castle anyway. And somehow with, I would say, this bishop diagonal, open files for both rooks like this, there is just excellent compensation. So knight e5 is actually a good example of that. While both squares are beautiful, you also have to look at how can you sort of utilize your pieces there. Knight d4 is less bad than the book gives, but the knight e5 is a better move is actually true. Anyway, let's discuss what happens after the move knight to d4. White just castles. And now the problem for black is, we have this great knight, but what are we going to do next? He starts pushing on the queen side, which is very logical, because there's little you can do on the king side, actually, I would say. In the game, he plays the move b5. I noted that modern computers prefers the move a5. And well, the idea is just that you want to grab a bit of space like this. Maybe you're also insinuating something like a3, opening the bishop's diagonal like that. So probably white should go rook ae1, and then they want to play b5, and they simply think a position like this, black is doing very, very well. And there is quite some truth in that, because what should white do next? In the game, he's doing something like f5, but here, after bishop e5, I would say this construction combined with this space actually is quite pleasant for black. I don't know how white should sort of manage to get the attack going. The computer says black is slightly better here, perhaps. Well, you can try moves like bishop to g5, but even a move like f6, cementing this beautiful bishop here, and let's say after rook something like bishop h6, you go rook e8, and due to you have this kind of space, maybe your rook is just perfectly safe on a7 and will sort of join the defense like this. It's a complicated position, but I have to say that I get the point of the move a5 here. But b5, nothing particularly wrong with that. The game goes king to h1, and maybe you should still push a5, I would make an argument for. The author mentions that, well, a part of the problem with having the knight on d4 is that if you now play the move c4, well, after bishop b1, this knight on d4 is actually not a strong piece. It's on the contrary, it's a trap piece. But sure, c4 is way too corporate. Well, you can defend it like this, but after something like, well, I guess you can't go rook fd1 because an f3 is hanging. But after a move like bishop to g5, your queen on e5 start being having some kind of trouble. Well, you can go here, but then you get f4 with quite an attack. Anyway, king h1, queen d7 is what happened. The game was rook a to e1, b4, f4, and now I would say almost a funny thing happens. That black plays the move h5 in this position, and our author says, okay, I'm incapable of understanding why would black play the move h5 in this position. And it's true, it looks like a ghastly move, simply. The reason I have hidden the moves, the names of the players until now is that, well, the white is Ivichukov, a very strong player, but black is Ding Liren. It's the current world champion, a player I have incredible respect for. He is the one who took over Magnus' title, and while he indeed here in 2024 had quite some bad time, he's just an incredibly strong player that, well, I mean it when I say I have incredible respect for him. But you will see players like this actually make weird moves like h5. I think simply he hadn't grasped what was going to happen next. In the game, well, he allowed the move f5, and he probably thought that, sure, I can put my bishop to e5, but now having played this h5 means that the whole structure becomes very weakened. We saw that in one of the previous games, that while playing h5, can have advantages, it can very much also ruin the black structure. The author says that even after in this position, you should play something like rook fc8, and after f5, bishop to e5. You remember I mentioned the computer preferred having the pawn here, and that would be a better version. I think rook fc8 is less useful than having pushed the pawn. But even here, the computer says not too bad, and the author says it's decent. But, well, poor Ding ended up having the pawn on an h5. And our sort of, hero in this game, Vichugov, exploits that with what I think looks very much like an illogical move, but it's quite strong. He plays the move bishop takes d4. And, well, why would you give up a bishop like that? But, the point is that it's a very opportune moment to do it. And I think I've mentioned earlier also that while this is a beautiful knight and this bishop doesn't do much, there is this sort of saying, or I would more say, to call it a principle is a bit too strong, or rule, but quite often, despite having a worse bishop against a strong knight, when there is this situation where you can actually take the knight, the advantage is that the bishop has the option to take the knight. It's not the other way around, typically. And this is a huge thing. You don't want to take immediately. It would have been a grave mistake to do it earlier. But you can take it exactly when the circumstances is right. And this kind of tension that one piece can take the other, but the piece cannot take back, is actually a huge sort of feature, I would say. So he takes on d4. And Ding is having a bad day. He takes back with the bishop. Of course, taking with the pawn is not really pleasant. You would much rather have control of the full diagonal, not blocking it yourself. And here, I think queen h6, somehow exploiting these weaknesses. And after bishop g7, you go to the g5 square. You intend to perhaps play f6. You massage this weakness. White is better, but it's still a game. Ding took with the bishop, which looks very logical, right? It keeps sort of the full contact in this diagonal. The problem is that, that is nice words, but it loses tactically. You can play the move e5, and suddenly this bishop starts waking up and exploiting this weakness in this diagonal. After bishop e5 takes e5, I guess you could even consider taking on g6, but Vichugov has more or less calculated till the end. He plays rook takes e5. After d5, he plays the move f6. Now the threat is queen to h6, just mating on the g7 square. So the only way to stop that is king h7, and then a very, very typical trick. He plays the move rook to f5. This threatens taking on h5. So let's say if you go, just queen takes d5, there is this thing, and, well, maybe queen h6 is good enough, but if you prefer to do everything with check, you can do it like this, and the game is over. And basically, there is just no reasonable way to defend in this position. You can sacrifice the queen, but we take it. And if you take back, there is queen d5, threatening mate on g7. And if rook g8, we're just going to take on h5 and checkmate. I almost feel it's wrong to give this example in a game by Ding, but, well, it wasn't me who chose it. It was the author of the book, and he did it in 2012. Ding is having a tough time at the moment, no doubt, but he is the world champion, and I think he has so much quality as a chess player that he's gonna come back. Not in this game, but I think his career is not really coming to an end. I think we still have to see a lot of Ding. At least I personally very much hope so. Talking about the game, sort of summing it up, it's a weird example due to this knight being here. But I thought it's an interesting discussion between which square is the best one. And at least for me, it's counterintuitive that the e5 square is your preferred one. Perhaps if you are an active player who likes to think in terms of counterplay and concrete things, you would be able to grasp that the e5 square is the best one. For me, I think more in structure, and the d4 square is beautiful because it can never be contested. And we saw in the game that it was well, we saw white's potential, but we also saw in the analysis that it's not that white by no means is better. So a square like the d4 one is not something you should give up trivially. But you saw how Vichugov did it and won a very nice game. So I thought a little bit of a weird example by the author, but still underlining some interesting points. The author wants to discuss this example, and it's quite interesting. If you look at the position, you can see that white has a pair of bishops, which in general you would say is quite an advantage. But from black's perspective, the nice thing is that he's exchanged a set of minor pieces. Well, that's quite a necessity for white to get the pair of bishops, that there actually is an exchange. But this means black has a little bit more space for his pieces, right? At the same time, black has quite useful active rooks, and he's also managed to get the pawn to c4, where it's somewhat active. So generally, I would say all the black pieces are in a very reasonable position. For white, the positive thing is that his position is incredibly stable. He still has the center, and like black, his pieces are also well placed. So let's see what actually happens here. Black now plays the move b5. This is, well, it's very logical. What else? I mean, this is the typical thing you would really like to do. And you're probably threatening b4, gaining more space, and perhaps following it up with knight c5, attacking the pawn on e4. What the author wants to show with this example is this typical way of sort of dealing with the counterplay of b5 in the Benoni. Because now white takes on b5 and plays the move b4. I remember myself, I was generally very scared of the Benoni my whole active career. I somehow, well, you know, I'm a player who likes to keep things under control. And the Benoni, well, there's breaks on this side, on that side, a lot of tactics to control. I would much rather have things felt comfortable for me. And this concept of having this pawn on b4, blocking the pawns like this, very much attracted me. And at some point, I was trying to get these kind of things in, but it didn't really work that well. Nowadays, you can just plug in your computer and it starts saying that the Benoni is a somewhat dubious openings. But this luxury we didn't have when I was young. Well, we did have computers, but they were not as massively strong as they are now. After b4, well, to me, at least the understanding was that, well, this is completely sort of making the black position passive, and there's not much he can do. Actually, the computer says, sure, no big deal. You should play something like, let's say, knight h5 first, and when this bishop retreats, then you will start doubling in the e-file, and you're doing pretty well. The author suggests that after b4, well, you should play the move rook e7. But the computer actually gives an interesting idea here for white. In the game, not in the game, in the book, he analyzes queen c2, rook e8, and so on and so forth. But the author, the computer says here, you should play the move queen to a2. This move I've never seen before, so I thought it's worth mentioning. I think the idea is that, well, you want to play the move queen a5, actually attacking this pawn. And that means black has to do something. I think the computer says you should go knight to e5 to have rook b7 defending it. But then we're not going to go queen a5. We're just going to play the move queen d2. And unlike in the line with the queen on c2, black cannot so easily double, or at least if he doubles, then the knight on e5 is somewhat in the way. So I thought queen a5 is a nice move. What the author wants to sort of explain is that after b4, of course, you can't take en passant. But now he thinks that white is better here. And, well, I say he thinks. I would have thought the same in his shoes. But computers are strong these days. The idea is, of course, this pawn is weak. It's basically going to be lost. If you go knight c5, we don't necessarily have to take immediately, because then you can take on e4. But we just go queen b4, which is basically an ideal setup for white. There will be a threat of taking this one later. It's more or less a dead pawn. And like this, we have enough pieces defending the e4 pawn with a massive edge. But black, in the style of Benoni, should play the move b4. Computer says knight b5. The book says knight b5, rook c1, knight takes e4. And the book makes the conclusion, white is just slightly better here with a pleasant position. And it's easy to understand in words. You have the pair of bishops. This knight is knight. It attacks the d6 square. Maybe you can even play something like rook c7. The problem is nowadays when we study chess, the computer just says, nah, black is completely fine here. I think it wants to play something like knight to c5. And this just says, well, the white advantage is optical. And who am I to argue against a very strong computer? So there is a few shortcomings with this example, I would say, in the concrete way. But in the general way, it's very interesting to sort of understand that this concept exists. It exists for players like me who wants to keep everything under control, but also that either if, well, as we saw in the example, if black takes the pawn and uses the activity, it might not be too bad, or even sort of, well, better play knight h first. Something like this, still there is sufficient activity. So this idea of b4, there is scenarios where it works quite well. And as we can see, it doesn't work that badly. But it's not a complete Benoni killer in any way. But the concept has a right to exist, and I think it's good we managed to cover it here. This is the game between Elyanov and Radjabov from Weigensee in 2008. If till now you felt a bit shortchanged as a black sort of side Benoni fan, well, you're right. We have only seen pretty much good scenarios for white. The author now tries to balance it with this game, which becomes a model game for black. But turning on a modern engine, actually it starts preferring white at quite some point. So I thought let's try and dig into the details. It's actually very interesting. The last moves has been e takes d5, c takes d5, giving it a Benoni structure. I think what comes to mind is probably this strong knight on e5, but quite surprisingly, Radjabov happily gives it up on d3. As we can see, there is a threat of taking the pawn on h6. You can say he can't take it immediately, because when we take back and the queen takes, there is a knight, sort of a bishop hanging on d3 by taking with the knight. So it is possible to play the move a6 without losing a pawn. But the problem is that white has this very strong move, bishop takes e5. If we take with the bishop, which we really would like to do to keep this sort of beautiful diagonal, then it's possible to take on h6. And if after bishop e5 we take back with the pawn on e5, we are getting this very, very passive pawn structure. We saw it in a previous game. Basically, black loses all the dynamics of his position. It's true that in this version, the knight is not easily getting to the c4 square. But even after a4, I think black has a pretty passive position with very little positive to do. I mean, well, white is threatening a5, crippling the queen side, and if you start playing f5, well, there's just no reasonable amount of counterplay there. So I think white is just much better here, and black is very passive. So Radjabov's decision is quite interesting. He just swaps on d3, and after white takes back, a very nice move b6. It's quite typical of Benoni. You see in several lines that black puts the bishop on a6. I think, well, you typically exchange on something in this diagonal. It's nicely out of the way there and quite active. And it also supports the b5 advance to some extent. It's just a useful way of developing, and in this other diagonal, there is not that many available squares. So it makes perfect sense, and is typical, as I mentioned. Elyanov backs back with the queen and wins a little bit of tempo attacking this pawn, but Radjabov just defends it like this. And now Elyanov plays the move knight g3, and it looks extremely logical, right? I mean, we just spoke about the bishop going to a6, trying to exchange himself of something, and why not go with the knight there? But I noticed the computer thought this is quite a mistake, and that sort of made me very curious. The author mentions that after a4, bishop to a6, rook fe1, queen d7, black is doing quite well. But actually here, white can now play the move knight to g3. And it makes sort of a difference. In the game, black would go rook fe8 instead, we will see. And this is a good version. If you start playing like in the game now, let's say with bishop to c1, then white has this very strong regrouping of knight d1. Perhaps the knight will go to f2 and even g4 and sort of work on the dark squares on the king side. And the computer thinks white is quite better here. So in this position, I thought, well, why not play the move rook e8 as happens in the game? If white plays knight g3 now, it just transposes. But the computer says in this position that g4 is a very strong move. This was extremely puzzling to me. But it basically wants to, control this f5 at once. And if you go like bishop c4 in the game, it's not even you want to go knight g3. He just goes to king g2, and let's say a6 trying to push b5. White has play on his own. He plays the move h4. You can't take it, because then rook h1 comes, and there is trouble at h6. And if you go b5 in this position, apparently white will play h5, undermining the king side, and after g5, even bishop g3, white is just better. If you start playing, let's say, b4, then there's going to be knight d1 jumping in this direction towards the f5 square. It's very puzzling for me that g4 can be so strong, but the computer is very insistent on that is a key theme in this kind of position. I've never seen it before. It's not like it's a decisive edge, but it turns this idea that in the game, Elyanov is kind of getting outplayed and seems to have just a bad position, to that he's actually in reality better here. In this position also, I spoke about that maybe black wants to exchange. I mean, you can take an e2, rook e2, queen d7, but here the computer doesn't want g4, but he wants another puzzling move. He wants just to play h4. I think, again, it grabs a bit of space. It does insinuate that at some point I could play the move h5, but mainly it's pretty difficult for black to do anything here, actually. If you play f5, you run into e5, which gives a nice structural change for white. And if rook a8, white just doubles here. Neither me nor the computer see anything that clearly equalizes for black. Maybe white is just gonna grab space either with g4 on the king side, or maybe even play h5. Somehow this bishop is attacking towards d6, so it's not easy to play f5. Oh, even if you play f5, there is the move e5 for white. So I'm very puzzled, but apparently, as Elyanov does, putting the knight on g3 is a kind of a strategic mistake, and a huge part of it is that you want to play the move g4 here. I barely can believe it when I tell you it like this, but it seems very much to be true. And well, the computer just kept outplaying me, and I sort of showed you the main lines here. So king h7 was the game, and Elyanov went the move knight to g3. Now, after bishop a6, rook fe1, he gets to play rook to e8. And somehow it becomes pretty harmonious. And while to me this actually looks like a good knight, it seems to have very little purpose. We saw, I mean, in the other lines, white got to play g4, h4, king to g2, and he was actually continuing to improve his position. While here, it's much harder to improve the white position. Elyanov chose to play a4, and now a quite nice move by Radyavov. He plays bishop to c4. It feels weird. It's basically, I would say, almost floating around on this square. But and let's say white can play a move like rook b1, perhaps threatening b3. But then the computer says you're just gonna go a5, and while this structure looks a little bit ugly, the bishop is going to feel decently safe on a6, and this b4 truss that is pretty typical is kind of, not kind of, it's fully stopped. And again, I guess this knight feels misplaced on g3. It has good defensive purposes, but there's really nothing positive white seems to be able to do in this position. Elyanov played the move knight to f1, and Radyabov took it. We spoke about this before, that this is sort of part of the idea, is that, well, this bishop on c8, I would say, because of this pawn structure, it has very little to do in this diagonal, right? All the squares are taken. So it makes sense to get rid of it sort of almost via the back door, as it happens here. So rook takes f1, a6. And now the game goes like black is just better here in a way. Again, the computer says, no, this is just because Elyanov plays way too stereotypical here. But I mean, this game is 2008, is way before modern computers. I guess we were not really able to grasp what White should play. The computer insists that, again, White should play the move g4. It looks borderlining insane in the sense that, well, isn't it just making f5 much more powerful? It's really not. It just looks like that if you sort of apply classical logic. So black goes queen d7, white plays king g2, just improving the position of his king. Now, well, you could play f5. I mean, you could even, well, play b5 first. And the next move, I'm very impressed with by the computer. It plays the move a5. It's extremely rare you see white playing a structural setup like this. It generally looks, isn't it just completely the black dream? You have gotten to push b5, and I mean, normally we would say this is an awesome structure, and this pawn on a5 is just completely misplaced. But the idea of a5 is keeping the a file closed. You are somehow suppressing the black counterplay. If the a file opened, that would be a focal point. I mean, well, we can see it like this, right? There is immediate activity in this direction, and white would have to deal with that. After the move a5, somehow it's not so easy for black to do something immediately. If you play b4 to get this square for the knight, the problem is that you can play the move knight a4. There's a direct threat of knight b6 forking, and if rook a d8, well, then knight b6, queen e7, rook a e1. The computer says just white is much better in this position. And I guess, sure, you can play knight b5, but maybe we are just, again, going to improve our position with h4. Maybe also the knight will jump to c4. But generally, it seems that there's actually very little black can do positively in this position. It's still a bit puzzling for me, but the computer is absolutely convinced white is just much better here. So after a5, my human instinct is that, okay, white has closed the queen side, and black is ideally set up for making the f5 counter thrust, undermining the white center. That's how it looks to me. But computer says takes, and knight to e2, and evaluates this as that white has a considerable advantage here. It took me a while to grasp it, but well, the knight is going to go to the g3 square, and from g3 it's both protecting the e4 pawn in a sort of defensive way, but it's very much also eyeing aggressively the f5 square. And it becomes beautiful coordination, and you can't really, let's say, do like this, because something like queen c2, there is a pin, and knight g3 is going to come next and pick up something. And this position, it's actually pretty bad for black. I mean, well, knight g3 is more or less unstoppable, and suddenly these normal positional things we would talk about on the queen side matters much less, right? It's going to be about king safety, where this one is exposed, and ours is decently safe on g2 or could retreat to h1. And this knight on g3 is just beautifully placed, combining defensive purposes of the e4 pawn, but very much looking forward into the f5 and h5 square. So white is clearly better here, at least somewhat better. And yeah, there is just, I cannot, I mean, my intuition tells me it's wrong, but I gave it a try, and it's obvious, the computers are right. White is pleasantly better here, and this is quite shocking in a model game from black's perspective. But it is, I mean, it's very hard to play a move like g4, at least it was at the time, but I think even nowadays, I don't have any kind of human examples where white plays like this and just control things. But it is very strong, there's nothing to say. Elyanov plays the move bishop g3, Radyabov got queens d7, rook ae1, b5 happens. And now Elyanov, I mean, he plays like a human being, right? He thinks that, okay, black is doing counterplay on this side. I have to push in the center. And it looks like a nice broad center. But the problem is that now you play the move b4, kicking the knight back, and now you undermine with f5. And simply this center starts to crack. And also we saw in the line before with, let's say, a knight on g3 and these pawns exchanged, then the black king was kind of exposed. Now in this position, the black king is just extremely safe here, and the center is cracking. There's no particularly reasonable move for white in this position. If you play e5, we're just going to take it, and this one is going to fall next. And, well, if knight f2, we can just put our bishop on d4, and still the structure in the center is gonna crack. Elyanov tried to take on f5, Radyabov to back with his queen, and after the move knight to e3, a very nice little you can't call it a sacrifice, you take it with the rook, and after rook takes e3, bishop to d4. Now you win the pawn on d5. It's true after bishop f2 takes here, you have given away your g7 bishop. And in principle, you don't like to do that. But the point is, after knight d5, we're going to go rook e8 next. And this idea of the black king being vulnerable, it's just not a reality. Elyanov tried the move rook to d1. It's in general a clever move. If you exchange on e3, then it's white who gets the e-file, and then this king can start feeling vulnerable. But Radyabov is a very exact player. So after rook d1, he played the move rook to e8. And basically, after bishop f2, knight takes f4, black is 2 pawns up, and I think after queen takes d4, there is queen e4 in the game, and he resigned. The point is that there is amazing threat on g2, obviously, and if you defend it with queen d7, it's rook e7, queen g4, knight e2 with a discovered check and winning the queen. So, I mean, you can say it's an impressive performance by Radyabov. He won a crushing game of chess. But from a structural point of view, I don't know what to say, because it's a model game for black. We see actually some very useful themes, like let's say this one with undermining this weak center, and this is a relevant position to understand. I also think that this move b6, it is a theme to know in the Benoni. But the narrative is very much broken by white actually being better in this position. This idea that, well, yes, you want your knight on g3, but you actually want to play g4 first, suppressing the f5 counterplay. It's quite puzzling to me. Or even in this position, here, if they take on e2 or go queen d7, that you play a move like h4. This is just, it's modern, fascinating chess. I have not seen it before, so I cannot guarantee you at all. I'm skeptical as I keep mentioning it here, but maybe this is how you should deal with the Benoni in a way. It's pretty bad news for Benoni if this is actually a nice position for white, but it seems to be so. But I think, well, we will see more examples like this, or well, rather we will see examples like this in human play. It's very interesting and very cutting edge. So I can understand if you're confused. I'm very confused myself, but I also felt that I very much learned some new understanding of the Benoni by looking at this example. Our final game in this Benoni chapter is Johan Hellstein against Cordova from 2006. The game is played in Buenos Aires, and it makes me a little bit smile because I start thinking about an anecdote about Johan Hellstein. I mean, we are basically sort of from the same generation. He's Swedish, I'm Danish. So, well, we grew up in Scandinavia together. And at some point I met him, and he told me that at some point in life, I realized that Scandinavian winters are optional. It's not a fact of life. So Hellstein just moved to South America, and I haven't been much in touch with him since. But a very nice guy and a very good chess player. But in this game, he kind of gets into trouble. He just played the move f3, And we have a, I would say, quite typical Benoni structure. In general, it looks pleasant for white. The pawns are here as an a4, basically meaning the b5 counterplay is hard to achieve, and also it's hard to sort of not just achieve it in the short term, but also in the long term. It's going to be really difficult to sort of get the pieces set up for that. The knight on g3, we have debated a little bit before. It's both positive and negative in a way. Perhaps it's slightly passive there, but it also defends both in terms of the e4 pawn, but very much also in suppressing the f5 counterplay. So black has to do something, but it's not that easy. Cordova plays the move knight to h7, which is very reasonable. Hellstein now retreats his bishop to e3. The computer suggests an interesting move, bishop to h4. And I remember having seen Dreev play this move actually in a very similar position. The computer says just a good move. For me, it's so difficult. It feels so uncomfortable. Constantly have to worry about g5 trapping this bishop, right? But actually, it's probably standing well there. It's sort of having considerable influence in this diagonal, and I don't know what it is in the human mind that, or at least in my mind, that means this bishop is misplaced on h5. But I think it's well, it is the tension it comes with due to this threat of g5. Well, this non-existing threat of g5, I would rather say. But well, it's the same thing you sometimes see, that weaker players, they are afraid of keeping tension in the center, because then you always have to figure out what happens if, and so on and so forth. And I think it's a little bit the same with the bishop on h4, that it could just be very well placed there, but it feels awkward. And, well, that's why our intuition says it's wrong, well, actually it doesn't seem to be. And that's sort of the interesting thing with computers, that they will override our biases at times, and we will try to learn from them. Anyway, Hellstein, well, quite humanly backed to e3. And after knight e5, a very interesting move. I played similar things in this kind of position, but normally, well, we will only play the move when we are forced to by h4. But Hellstein actually voluntarily put his knight on the h1 square. It looks insane, right? We are known to this sort of phrase that knights on the rim are dim, but knights in the corner, it becomes even worse, right? It's literally only going into two squares. But of course, we are not planning to keep our knight on this, well, horrible square in itself, but we see it as a route to the f2 square, where actually it very nicely sort of covers the e4 square, but it's much less exposed than on g3. And because of the somewhat surprisingly slow nature of this position, right, that f5 is not, it's possible, but it's not that horrible as a threat. White has time to do this kind of odd, but still typical maneuver. He's just improving the position of his piece. Cordova goes to bishop to d7. And now the author goes to quite some length to explain that this knight on e5 is starting to feel short of squares. But you can't really exploit it. Let's say you play the move f4 first. Well, then there's only the g4 square available. You take it. I guess you could take back with the h-pawn, but the author mentions taking with the bishop. And this point is that should you choose to go f5 now, intending to trap it with h3, then there is this, well, even let's say if you do like this, we can play the move h3, and you probably are forced to play f4, but something like this, even if the bishop goes back, comes knight g3, and there is weaknesses like this. But after f5, you have the very nice move, bishop takes f5. And if e takes f5, this typical small tactic, rook e3. And if queen e3, that is bishop d4, with a pin like this, winning the queen, right? So f4 doesn't really work here. What about h3, the author says? You are just threatening to go f4 next and trapping this knight. But then you can exploit that white has actually played h3 and knight h1 by, well, these are slow moves and the knight is out of play. It's not very surprising that black can react with some kind of activity. And if you play b5, well, the knight gets an escape square on the c4 square, so white kind of has to take on b5, but then it becomes, well, after exchanges, almost some kind of Volga-like counterplay. And if you play bishop f1, then there is this very simple trick of rook b2, because there is the discovered check and we win the queen, right? So it's not possible here to trap this knight on e5. But Hellstein doesn't particularly want to do that. He plays the move knight to f2. Now, the author says this b5 tactic we just saw doesn't really work. The computer thinks not really. The author's point is, so let's say exchange here, take on b5, and this exchange rook to b8. Now the author says there is this very nice move, rook to a5, just safeguarding this bishop. And that is true, but black has a funny resource I've never seen before. The move bishop to f6. He actually just wants to go bishop to d8, and then sort of attack the rook, and then the bishop on b5 is going to be in trouble. I think white is probably still okay here, but it's not at all worse for black. So the b5 move that gets criticism in this position by the author is actually very decent. But for our perspective, it's nice he plays f5, because we get a very interesting structure here. I remember earlier in my career, I thought, okay, this must be a dream Benoni for black, right? I was sort of thinking, well, you know, there's activity like this. We have an active pawn here that can go further. But later, sort of, you know, getting more experienced, I also started to understand that there's a lot of defensive potential in the white position, right? I mean, these knights are very solid and stable, and they keep the e4 pawn protected. And it's not so obvious what should black do next. Hellstein actually plays the move h3, just asking black, what are you going to do? I'm just slightly going to improve my position. But it would have been more exact to take on f5 first. The point is, if he takes back with the bishop, well, then this theoretical debate about these knights covering the e4 square suddenly becomes not just theory, but very relevant. One of them can actually jump to the square. Perhaps the computer says you should play the move h3 first. It starts insinuating g4 or f4, starting to push the black pieces back. The typical move would be g takes f5, right? I mean, this in the sort of style of playing active chess. Well, you're capturing towards the center and you're somehow hoping for activity. But the reality is somewhat different. And it's a very nice move by white here. The move knight to h3. It's basically starting to, I mean, become too much that we have just jumped around like this. But with this pawn structure, this is a very strong knight. It's mainly aiming towards the f4 square, where we'll stand very nicely, blocking this pawn on f5 and also attacking towards the other pawn on sort of on h5. And I think the black position is quite difficult here. It's not lost or much worse, but white is better, and I think it's possible to quite understand that this idea of black activity by having played moves like this. Well, where is the activity? No, they are weakening moves rather than they are active moves, and white has done this quite cleverly. Hellstein unfortunately plays the move h3. And now it's less great for him. Cordova plays h4, and now we can see that if ef5, gf5, it's a completely different scenario, because, well, there's no knight h3 jump anymore, and if you can't go to d3 because then the knight jumps to c4 and it collapses here. So this position is considerably more difficult for Hellstein. It's not like his position is bad, but you lost some of the, I would say, potential by not interpreting to take on f5 in time. Hellstein went rook ae1, then the opponent played queen a5, then he starts threatening b5, so Hellstein went back with a rook on a1. His opponent was probably thinking momentum was on his side, so he played the move rook a to b8. And now Hellstein goes astray. The computer still thinks that if you play not rook a to e1, but rook f to e1, you are still slightly better. But I cannot argue against that with facts. But a move like rook e7, for instance, if you're a Benoni player with black, you have to accept this kind of mess. Sure, white is a little bit better, but you're playing the Benoni, you have kept a bunch of pieces on the board, you want to have a complicated position, that comes at some kind of tax. And I think this is just a decently average Benoni position that is perhaps objectively moderately pleasant for white, but it's very playable for black, and you will have to live with this. As we see in the game, it goes very much downhill for Hellstein quickly. Knight f6 happens here. Hellstein has this idea of bishop g5. Well, he lured the pawn here to sort of claim it was a weakness, but he had very much underestimated what happened now. The move knight to f7 starts hitting on this bishop. The problem is that if you take the pawn here, well, actually the author gets it wrong according to the computer. The computer says you should play the move g5, and after bishop g3, f4, something like this, you have amazing compensation on the dark square. You see, well, this bishop is going in this direction, this bishop is sort of badly placed there, and maybe also we can jump with a knight to e5. This is objectively better for black. The author says the move f4 is good, but he's actually missing a typical tactic. It's true that if black gets to control, let's say something like bishop takes f6, sure, white has an extra pawn and in general a safe structure, but black has amazing compensation on the dark squared here. I mean, a bishop can go to d4, a knight to e5, and we will play perhaps king g7, rook h8, etc., etc. It's great compensation because even if the position stabilizes, there is just structural compensation for black. But white has the chance to actually change this dynamic. In this position, there is this very strong move e5. E5 here. The idea is that you are vacating the e4 square. You're basically giving away a pawn. Just sort of after knight e5, this exchange, you can put something on e4. You will actually rather not have a pawn on e4 than to have a pawn simply because, well, this is changing the dynamics completely. And now, well, the black bishop didn't get to d4, and suddenly, instead of having a pawn on e4 that blocks white play, suddenly there is activity flowing towards this square. Maybe the knight will jump to g4. Not at all particularly bad for black, but very much sort of changing both the objective value, but also very much the, I would say, the trend of the game. So this is, well, e5 is a typical move that you sacrifice to get a square, and here it seems to work quite well. Hellstein decided to go back in this position to d2, and now after knight h5, he has kind of been outplayed. Maybe he was sort of thinking that this sort of discovered thing in this diagonal would help him, but there seems to be no reasonable way to do it. I mean, you can't really play knight b5 and attack d6 because the knight is just defending it, so it makes little sense. Now this knight starts controlling the g3 square and also the bishop to d4, and I think this knight on f2, it actually feels uncomfortable having the pawn on h3, so there's no really good way to maneuver back into the game. Hellstein took on f5, and black took back like this, and I think the game was bishop d3, knight g3, and now Hellstein is trying some kind of tactics, but it doesn't work. He went back here, and well, I'm just showing the last couple of moves because there is a nice end to the game. So queen c7, rook e1, c4, knight c d1, b5, takes, bishop f1, queen c5, and there is an exchange like this. And in this position, well, the opponent doesn't take back on g7, but plays rook e1, and there's no reasonable way of stopping rook takes f1, and it's going to be made soon. So okay, this doesn't have sort of much relevance, but I thought it was a beautiful way. I think actually the point is, let's say after bishop f6, say you take, and now you do mate like this. I think this position is nice to have on the board. It's a rare thing, and I guess it also sort of made our author choose this game. Again, I feel pity for Benoni fans for black, because we really would like to paint this sort of picture of black having very fascinating counterplay here in this kind of Benonis. But even here, it seems white is better. I'm a bit in love with this move bishop to h4. Maybe not to the extent that I would dare play it myself, but it's cool that chess have this kind of ideas of things that looks very counterintuitive. And similar with the move knight to h1. I mean, doing it without even being forced to it by h4, but just doing it voluntarily is cool. And I think this idea of locating the knight on h3, jumping to the f4 square, if you care about Benoni from white's perspective, you should know it, but of course also as black you should understand that such things can end up pretty poorly for you. But yeah, in general, if you want to play the Benoni, it seems that this course is not going to help you. You have to get a winning with the Benoni course. We seem to think that white is doing pretty well in the Benoni, and that's yeah, that is also to some extent the case. I think Nigel Short is famous for saying at some point when he was playing the Stonewall, they said that, isn't it a bad opening? He said, maybe, but it's much better than the Benoni. I don't think that's actually the case, but Benoni is kind of dubious for a reason. But, well, in the meantime, black quite wins some games in the style of Tal that, well, you can't object to necessarily be better all the time, but the point of chess is to win a game. I don't know if that makes you more comfortable playing the Benoni, but I think that's kind of the hope there is there. So yeah, good luck with it.